The train was 12 minutes late into Harlan Crossing, which put the banker's lateness at 24 minutes by the time anyone thought to count. She did not count. She stood on the platform with the brown leather satchel in her left hand and watched the town arrange itself in her peripheral vision. The grain elevator pale against the June sky, the main street running straight west until the buildings thinned to nothing, and the prairie continued without apology. A dog moved under the depot bench. Two men outside the feed store had stopped talking. The satchel had a brass clasp that caught the light when she shifted her grip. She did not shift her grip. The heat was different than Bristol. Drier. It came from the ground as much as from above, and the dust had an alkaline quality she noted the way she noted most things. Filed, referenced against nothing yet, held for later. She was 24 years old and had been filing things since she was 9, seated on a stool beside her father's desk, learning that every column had an opposite column, that nothing existed only once in a well-kept book. The platform had not been empty when the train arrived. A woman in a gray dress had watched from the far end. 3 men near the water barrel had not quite looked away. By supper, half the town would know what she looked like. By morning, the rest would know the banker had made her wait. She knew this because small towns were not different from small counting houses in the way that mattered. Everyone tracked the ledger of everyone else, debits and credits, who owed whom a greeting, who had been made to stand in the heat with a satchel and no one beside her. She set the satchel down, not out of fatigue. She simply decided the ground could hold it as well as her hand, and there was no reason to perform vigilance in front of strangers. A boy near the depot door was staring. She looked at him directly, and he looked away, then back, then away again. The station master came out with a clipboard and did not quite approach her. He stood at a useful distance and cleared his throat. She waited. "Wagon's been sent," he said finally. "He got held up at the bank." She nodded once. "It's a short ride," he offered. "Quarter mile." She nodded again. He went back inside. She looked down the main street again. The dry goods sign needed repainting. The second S in Harlan's was nearly gone. The building beside the livery had a door that hung 2 degrees off true. The bank itself sat at the corner of the main intersection, brick-fronted. The only brick on the street, which she understood was the point. The brass clasp on the satchel was warm from the sun. She waited. She watched. She did not look toward the road more than once. The wagon came from the east end of the street. A single bay horse, unhurried. The driver was not the banker. A hired hand, young, who climbed down without looking at her and reached for the satchel before she had lifted it. She picked it up herself. He stepped back and said nothing, and she climbed up unassisted. The house was a quarter mile as stated. Frame construction, 2 stories, a porch that needed its boards re-nailed along the left side. She noted the loose boards as the wagon stopped. He was waiting at the door. 51, she had known from the correspondence. He looked older by the eyes and younger by the shoulders. A man who still believed his posture could answer for other things. He was dressed for company, which she was apparently not, and he took that in briefly before extending his hand to help her down. She had already descended. "Miss Alcott," he said, "you made good time." "The train was punctual," she said. He showed her the house in the manner of a man who expected to be thanked for each room. The parlor, the kitchen, the dining room with its oval table set for 2. He had arranged a cold supper: sliced beef, bread, a dish of pickled something she did not examine closely. She sat where he indicated. He poured water from a pitcher, and she noticed his hand move to the right side of the table twice, before he recalled himself and sat opposite her. He talked through the meal. She listened and ate. The arrangement, as he described it, was practical and clean. She would manage the household. She would appear at his table when he entertained, which was frequent, he said. The town was growing. Men of consequence came through on the rail line. She would pour coffee and hold conversation at whatever level the occasion required. He said, hold conversation as a man says, hold a lamp. Useful, secondary, something to be pointed at whatever needed light. She waited until he had finished. May I keep my own accounts? She said. He looked at her the way a man looks at a question he had not considered because it had never occurred to him to consider it. Then he cut another slice of bread. I see no reason why not, he said. She nodded once. He moved the conversation to the Bankers Association meeting in September, the new grain elevator going up on the south end, the state of the road to Dodge. She listened and answered at intervals and finished her supper. The pickled dish was cucumber, slightly oversalted. When the plates were cleared, she excused herself and carried the satchel upstairs to the room he had shown her. The window faced the main street. She set the satchel on the bed and opened the brass clasp and took out the double-entry ledger and set it on the writing table. The candle was already lit. She opened to the first page. The first week she said very little at dinner that was not required. He had guests 3 times: a rancher from the North Fork, 2 men from the county commissioner's office, and on Thursday evening the teller from the bank itself, a thin man with a careful part in his hair who spoke about deposits the way a doctor speaks about a patient he expects to recover but is not certain of. She poured. She passed the bread. She answered when spoken to and did not speak into silence. She was listening for numbers. It began on the second evening with the rancher. He mentioned an interest payment, a figure, a rate, a date. She noted it the way she had learned in her father's counting house, not by writing, not yet, but by placing it against everything adjacent to it. The term of the loan, the sum implied, the rate that would be required to produce the payment he named. The rate was not the posted rate. It was lower by enough to matter. She said nothing. She refilled his coffee and moved the cream. By Thursday, she had 3 such figures. The teller produced a 4th without meaning to, a passing reference to a land note and its quarterly service, dropped into conversation about the grain elevator, the way a man drops a match without watching where it falls. She caught it. She set it beside the others in the space behind her eyes where she kept such things. That night she went upstairs and opened the ledger. She had used the first page to record the household accounts, the cost of the week's provisions, the coal, the 2 candles she had replaced. Standard entries, clean and exact, the way her father had shown her at the small table in the back of his Bristol office, the one that smelled of iron filings and tallow. She turned to the second page. At the top she wrote a date and a single heading in her careful hand. Below it she began to reconstruct what she had heard. She did not know the bank's actual books. She knew only the edges of them, the figures that escaped into dinner conversation, the gaps between what was said aloud and what the arithmetic required. But her father had taught her that the edges were enough. The numbers at the center will arrange themselves to match the numbers at the periphery, he had told her. If they do not, the center is wrong. The center was wrong. She worked for an hour. She did not reach a conclusion. She had too few figures for a conclusion. What she reached was a shape in which certain payments did not account for themselves, in which certain obligations seemed to rest on land whose value she could not verify, in which the rate the teller implied bore no consistent relationship to the rate the guests described. She did not name what she was looking at. She closed the ledger, extinguished the candle, and lay in the dark, listening to the town settle around her. 3 weeks of edges were enough to tell her she needed the center. She did not go looking for it. She simply began to notice the desk. It sat in the room he called his study, a room she had no reason to enter and every reason to understand. She passed it twice a day, once in the morning when she brought his coffee and set it on the hall table, and once in the evening when she extinguished the lamp in the corridor. The door was usually closed. When it stood open, she did not look in. She had learned that restraint was its own form of intelligence. In the 4th week, he fell asleep in his chair after supper. She could hear his breathing from the hallway, a low, irregular sound. A man who had eaten too much and trusted his household to manage itself. She stood at the corridor lamp for a moment. Then she walked to the study. The bottom drawer was unlocked. She did not know why she tried it. Or perhaps she did. The ledger inside was smaller than his household book, bound in dark green cloth with no label on the spine. She carried it to the window where the moonlight was sufficient. She stood rather than sat. She did not want to be settled into the room. It took her less than an hour. The handwriting was his, cramped, irregular, the figures written fast by a man who had not been trained to write figures. She could see the places where he had gone back to correct an entry, not in the honest manner of crossing out and initialing, but in the manner of a man trying to make something look like it had always said what it now said. She had seen that in her father's clients sometimes. The revisions that were not revisions. The land parcels were listed by section and township, the way Kansas law required. Against each was a loan figure, a borrower, a payment schedule. She recognized some of the names from dinner conversation, men who had spoken of their prospects with confidence, who had accepted his handshake and his credit as though both were solid. The title encumbrances were not listed, but their absence was its own entry. She understood, looking at column after column of loans secured against land whose clear ownership was not in evidence, that the whole structure rested on a presumption. The presumption that no one would look. She replaced the ledger exactly as she had found it. She adjusted the drawer until it sat the way it had sat. She walked back down the corridor. He was still asleep. In her room, she opened her own ledger. She dipped the pen. She thought for a moment about what was accurate, what was precise, what was sufficient. She wrote 4 words. The land is not his. She blotted the line, closed the ledger, and set it back inside the brown leather satchel. The brass clasps closed with a small, clean sound. She did not change anything about her mornings. She was at the table before him. Coffee made, the ledger open to the household column, the pen dry until she needed it. She poured his cup without being asked. She wrote what he told her to write. When he left for the bank, she cleared the breakfast things and began the day's accounts, and no one watching, would have seen anything different in her from the week before or the week before that. But she had begun to listen differently. The dinner guests came on Thursdays, sometimes Tuesdays if there was a deal being discussed. She served, she refilled. She moved between the kitchen and the table in the way that allowed her to hear without being in the room. Men talked more freely when a woman was carrying plates. She had understood this since her father's house. She let them talk. What she heard, she held. She did not write it that night. She went to the county recorder's office on Saturday mornings, which was the errand she had established for purchasing sundries at the dry goods. The posted notices were public. Anyone could read them. No one did, particularly. She read them with the attention her father had taught her, not for the facts themselves, but for what the facts implied when arranged beside other facts. She was doing arithmetic no one had asked for. By the end of her first autumn in Harlan Crossing, she had a secondary column in her ledger, kept on the final pages, written small. Not figures drawn from the household accounts. Her own. A map in numbers of what the town actually was. The grain elevator had borrowed against next year's yield. That was common. That was recoverable if the harvest held. The dry goods store carried more stock than its sales suggested. She had seen the invoices once when she was asked to sign for a delivery he could not collect. The milliner's rent had been raised twice in 18 months without explanation in the county notice she had found. The livery's water rights were registered to a holding company she could not locate by name. Some of this was ordinary. Some towns were built from credit and hope, and most of them held. But she was beginning to see which foundations here were poured and which were assumed. The doctor's instrument order arrived that November. She saw the crate at the freight window when she was mailing a letter. He mentioned it at supper that week as evidence of Harlan Crossing's prosperity. New surgical instruments, modern equipment. The town was growing. She asked quietly whether the doctor had benefited from the bank's support. He said yes, naturally. The doctor was a good investment. She said nothing more. She refilled his coffee. That night, she opened her ledger and added a row. Beside the doctor's name, she wrote the loan figure she had calculated from the interest he'd mentioned, and the term. Then she drew a small line beneath it and moved to the next column. The dry goods merchant's wife came to her in February of 1881, not to the house, but to the street, stopping her on the way back from the post office with a basket of mending under one arm and a look that was trying very hard to be something other than what it was. She needed $11. Her husband had ordered stock on credit in October, and the freight charge had come in higher than the invoice. The discrepancy was $4.60. Combined with the note already owed to the bank, $11 was what stood between them and a letter she did not want to receive. She listened. She did not say yes or no on the street. That evening, she wrote a letter of her own. She quoted a term of 8 months and a simple interest rate she had arrived at by calculation rather than convention, lower than the bank's posted rate, high enough to document the transaction as a loan and not a gift. She included a single sentence stating that repayment could be made in installments, so long as each installment was recorded in writing by both parties. She sealed the letter and walked it to the dry goods counter herself the following morning, addressed to the wife. There was no conversation about it. The wife received the letter, read it at the counter, folded it, and placed it in her apron pocket. That was the whole of it. 8 months later, the first installment arrived in a small envelope slid under the front door. Inside was a note in careful handwriting, the figures correct to the cent. She recorded it in her ledger, drew the line, and moved on. The milliner was next. 1882, $19, a dispute over a lease clause that had quietly doubled her liability exposure. Then the livery in 1883, $43, for the water rights registration fee that the holding company had somehow neglected to process, leaving the livery's access to the creek unprotected on paper. The school teacher's supply fund in 1883 as well, $8, because the county had promised a disbursement that had not arrived by September, and the children were sharing slates. None of these were discussed at supper. She made certain of that. Each loan traveled through an intermediary. A letter, a third party, a quiet word passed through the milliner to the livery owner, never originating visibly from the house. What the town saw, if it saw anything, was a series of small, lucky turns. A supplier extending credit. A clerical error corrected. A neighbor with a spare $8 and a generous spirit. What she saw was a ledger with 7 rows begun by 1885, each one documented with the precision her father had taught her. Date, principal, term, rate, repayment schedule, current balance. She kept the ledger in the brown satchel. The satchel stayed in the wardrobe behind her winter dresses, brass clasp facing the wall. No one asked what was in it. By 1886, the evidence was becoming visible if you knew how to look. The dry goods store had expanded its back room. Not dramatically. 3 additional shelves, a second scale, a small glass case for items that warranted protection from dust. But the shelves were stocked through January, which they had not been in the 3 years prior. The milliner had hired a girl on Saturdays. The livery had fenced a second paddock, and the fence was straight and new. The town said, "Good year for cattle." The town said, "Weather's been kind." She said nothing. She made a note in the ledger. What the town could not see, because it lived inside the results rather than the structure beneath them, was that 3 of the 7 had quietly stopped guessing at their own numbers. The dry goods owner had begun keeping a daily record of stock movement, not because she had told him to keep one, because she had, twice in 2 years, asked him a specific question. What was your cost on the last bolts of muslin, and what did you receive for them? And when he had not known the answer precisely, she had waited with the patience of someone who understood the weight of not knowing. He had gone home both times and found the figure. The third time she asked, he had it ready. She had not called this anything. There was no lesson given, no method explained. She had simply asked the question that required the answer, and the answer had required the record, and the record had required the habit. That was how her father had taught her, at 9 years old, sitting at the counting-house table on a Tuesday morning in Bristol while the fog pressed against the windows. He had not said, "Here's how you keep accounts." He had said, "What did we pay for the cloth?" And when she did not know, he had waited. The milliner was different. She had learned a different way. Through the invoices she had submitted for the second loan, which had been returned to her with 2 lines of pencil notation in a hand she did not recognize, pointing out that she had been absorbing the cost of a supplier's rounding error across 18 months without catching it. 40 cents per transaction, negligible per month, significant across a year and a half. The milliner had corrected the supplier contract. She had also, quietly, begun checking every invoice before payment. The livery owner had learned nothing structural. He ran his operation by instinct and did so competently. She had not tried to change that. She had simply ensured the water rights were registered and let him continue as he was. You did not teach everyone the same way. Some needed the record. Some needed the one question asked twice. Some needed only to have the paperwork in order and be left alone. The ledger in the satchel now had a second column she had added in 1885, not for principal and interest, but for capacity. By 1888, the second column had 41 entries. She had not planned for 41. She had planned for 7, one per business, which was how many she could manage without the pattern becoming visible to anyone watching the flow of money through town. But interest compounds, and so does knowledge, and by the end of 1886 she understood something she had not understood when she stepped off the train. That money, when it is moved carefully and documented precisely, generates more money not through risk, but through patience. The accumulated interest from the 7 loans had reached a figure that was no longer modest. It was, in fact, a foundation. She spent most of 1887 reading Kansas territorial law. The statutes were available at the county clerk's office, which she visited 4 times over 6 months, each time requesting a different volume, each time making her notes in her own hand, and returning the volumes to the clerk without comment. He was a young man who found the work dull. He never asked what she was looking for. She had counted on that. A land trust could be incorporated under territorial statute with a single founding member, a stated purpose of civic improvement, and a capital deposit filed with the county recorder. The founding document required 2 signatures, the incorporator and 1 witness. She drafted the document herself. It took her 3 versions across 11 days to arrive at language that was accurate, legally sufficient, and entirely unremarkable to anyone who read it without care. She chose the banker as witness because he was the most visible man in Harlan Crossing, and his signature on the founding line would give the instrument social weight without requiring him to understand it. She also chose him because she understood his habits precisely. He signed documents at his desk on Thursday mornings after the mail arrived, before the teller came with the daily reconciliation. He signed quickly and did not read closely when the document was placed on top of other correspondence he had already decided to approve. She placed it on a Thursday morning in March. She said it was a community charitable instrument. She said the county required a local witness of standing. She set it at the top of the stack, the signature line clearly marked, her own signature already in place below the founding date. He signed it in under 4 seconds. He did not ask the name of the trust. He did not ask what land was held in it, or what the capital figure represented, or what civic improvement meant in practice. He handed the pen back to her and returned to the mail. She said thank you and left. The founding date on the charter was June 14th, 1879. She had written it in before she came downstairs. She had chosen that date 9 years earlier, standing on the platform with the satchel in her hand, looking at the town for the first time and understanding, with the particular clarity of someone trained from childhood to read numbers, exactly what she was looking at. By the end of 1890, the trust held title to 6 parcels. The first had been a narrow strip of grazing land east of the grain elevator, purchased through the cooperative's treasurer in the spring of 1889. The second was a corner lot on the main street, acquired when the original owner died without clear heirs, and the estate sat unclaimed for 18 months. The third, fourth, and fifth were adjacent residential lots north of the livery, purchased at intervals, quietly, the deeds transferred through the dry goods owner's brother-in-law, who worked in the county recorder's office and understood that his instructions were simple and that questions were not part of them. The sixth was the largest, 40 acres of watershed land above the town's western edge, land that controlled access to the creek that fed every well on the main street. She had wanted that parcel for 3 years before it became available. When it did, she moved within a week. None of the 7 businesses knew what connected them. Each had borrowed from a different third party. Each had repaid in full, with interest, and had been told simply that the lender wished to remain private. The trust's name appeared in no conversation she had heard about herself. In the banker's house, she managed the household accounts with the same precision she had brought in 1879. She ordered the coal. She reviewed the kitchen expenses. She sat at his table when guests came, poured coffee, answered questions about Bristol with the same 3 sentences she had always used, and excused herself when business turned to figures. She had learned, long ago, that being excused from the room was not the same as being absent from it. The satchel lived on the shelf above the small writing desk in her room. It still held her father's ledger. It held now also the trust charter, the original, not a copy, folded once, lying flat beneath the ledger, the 2 documents pressed together by the brass clasp she had not replaced in 11 years. She did not take the charter out often. When she did not read it. She knew every word. She had drafted the language herself, working from a territorial incorporation statute she had borrowed from the county clerk's reference shelf on a Tuesday afternoon in 1887 and returned the following Thursday. She would look at it long enough to confirm the founding date, June 14th, 1879. Then she would fold it again, set the ledger back on top, and close the clasp. Outside, the town moved through its autumn. Cattle drives passing on the southern road, the school teacher taking delivery of new arithmetic primers, smoke from the laundry rising in the cold morning air. The banker's correspondence had been heavier than usual that fall. She had begun to read the pattern in it. The secondary ledger was unlocked again in January. She had not looked for the opportunity. She had simply gone to the desk to retrieve the household account book, which the banker kept in the top drawer, and found the bottom drawer standing an inch open. He had been distracted that week. A letter from a creditor in Topeka, another from a land office whose name she did not recognize. She did not hurry. She opened the drawer the rest of the way, lifted the ledger, and read it at the desk as the morning light came through the east window. It took her 40 minutes. When she finished, she set the ledger back exactly as she had found it, closed the drawer to its inch, and went to start the breakfast fire. The numbers were not ambiguous. They had never been ambiguous. Not when she had first read them 11 years ago, not now. But there was a quality to them in January of 1891 that had not been present before. The interest obligations had compounded past the point where any plausible revenue could service them. The land held as collateral. The parcels she had tracked through the county assessor's filings, one dry Tuesday each spring, had been pledged twice in several cases, 3 times in one. The teller's window receipts, which she had been estimating from the pattern of the banker's Thursday deposits, had been declining since the previous spring. The bank would not survive the year. She cracked 2 eggs into the iron pan and listened to them settle. 11 weeks. That was the measure she allowed herself. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was what the arithmetic permitted. Move too quickly and the pattern would be visible. Move too slowly and the window would close. She began with the laundry. A Tuesday in February, ordinary conversation. The question of whether the family might consider moving their deposits to a more stable instrument. A trust account, she explained, that was insured against the kind of bank failures that had been troubling the eastern counties. She had read about it. She had prepared a simple explanation. She left it with them in writing. She moved to the grain elevator that same week. The livery, the week after. Each conversation was different. Each family had a different fear, a different vocabulary for trust. She adjusted. She did not rush. She made no reference to the banker, to the secondary ledger, to anything she had not been invited to discuss. She simply described a thing that existed. She described it accurately. She answered every question asked of her. By the end of March, she had reached 5 of the 7 businesses. The dry goods owner asked her once how she knew. She said she read the papers. He accepted that. She poured his coffee and left. The banker died on a Tuesday. She was in the kitchen when the housekeeper came to the door. The housekeeper said his name, then said he had not come down for breakfast, then said he was on the floor of his bedroom with one hand against the wall. She listened. She set down what she was holding. She went upstairs. He looked smaller than he had in life. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that his pocket watch had stopped at 7:15. She sent for the doctor. Then she sat at the kitchen table and waited. And while she waited, she opened her satchel and wrote the date in the margin of the trust ledger. Not a record of anything, just the date. The funeral was held on a Friday. Half the town came. Men who had borrowed from him, men who had been refused, men who had eaten at his table and discussed their prospects in voices they thought she could not hear from the kitchen. She stood among them in black wool, her chin level, her hands still. The minister spoke of industry and Christian character. She listened to all of it. She went home and worked. The following Monday, the bank did not open. A notice appeared on the door, county letterhead, the language formal and bloodless, pending assessment of accounts. By Tuesday, the word insolvent was moving through town the way such words do, first in whispers, then in plain speech, then in the voice of a man standing outside the general store, making calculations out loud for anyone who cared to hear. She watched it from across the street. Not one of the 7 families lost $1. The laundry, the livery, the grain elevator, the dry goods store, the milliner, the school supply fund, the doctor, each had moved their deposits in the preceding weeks into the trust account she had described. The money was there. It had always been there. It would continue to be there. She did not explain this to anyone. They did not ask. When the dry goods owner came to her door 3 days after the bank closed, his hat in both hands, she poured him coffee and answered his questions plainly. Yes, the trust account was unaffected. Yes, the funds were accessible. Yes, everything was documented. He left with the papers under his arm and his hat back on his head. She stood at the door for a moment after he turned the corner. The October air came through from the street. Somewhere on the next block, a child was calling to someone, the sound carrying in the cold in the way. Sounds do when the air is very clear. She went back inside. She closed the door. She sat down and continued working. The assessor's report arrived in February. It came in the post, folded inside a brown envelope with the county seal, addressed to the Harlan Crossing Improvement Society in care of the trust's registered address, which was the house. She received it on a Tuesday morning, set it on the table, and finished her coffee before she opened it. The document was 11 pages, dense columns, property descriptions, acreage figures, assessed valuations. She read it the way she read everything, from the top, without skipping ahead, noting the figures as she went. The Harlan Crossing Improvement Society appeared on page 7. The listing took 4 lines: total acreage, assessed value, legal description of the trust structure, and then, at the end of the entry, a parenthetical in smaller type that the assessor had apparently added by hand. Largest private landholder, current filing period, state of Kansas. She read it twice. Then she set the report down on the table beside the satchel, which was open. The brass clasp caught the window light the way it always had, a brief and clean flash that landed and disappeared. The leather was worn now at the corners. 13 years will do that to a thing carried daily. She uncapped the pen. The current ledger was the 4th one. The first, her father's, with his careful Bristol hand on the opening entries, was tucked beneath the others, the pages grown soft at the edges from handling. She had not retired it. She had simply continued where he left off, in the same columns, with the same double entry discipline he had taught her when she was 9 years old, and her feet did not reach the floor from the counting-house stool. She made the entry. Date. Reference to the assessor's report. The current total valuation of the trust holdings. The number of active loan instruments under management. The balance in the reserve fund. Each figure in its column, each column balanced against the other. At the bottom of the entry, she noted the trust's founding date, as she did at the start of every new ledger year. June 14th, 1879. The same day she had stepped off the train onto the Harlan Crossing platform, with the morning still early, and the dust not yet risen, and the whole town visible in one turn of the head. She capped the pen. She set it on the table. She looked out the window at the street. The elm that someone had planted outside the dry goods store in 1881 was bare still, too early in the year for leaves, but the shape of it was good. It had grown well. Another decade and it would put the whole front of the building in shade. She pulled the next ledger toward her and opened it to the first page. There was more work to do.